There's a lot to do today, and I think this is value added. I just want to basically thank the Gilbert Stuart Birthplace Museum for putting this on. Like the other lectures, it's going to be recorded and available probably in about a week. And you can let everyone who wasn't able to make it today know that they can see it online. We also have these, if you have not gotten one of these before. This is the commemorative booklet for the 350th anniversary. It's got a nice fold-out map of North Kingstown in there. Despite what it says on the front, it is free, so you can take as many copies as you like. And if you ever run into a case where you'd like more, we'll be at the concerts down at the beach and be able to pass them out there. But like you, I look forward to Michelle's presentation, and let's go.
And this is Michelle Lee Leonard, our Executive Director. Her background is in art history. We're so thrilled that she's here with us at the Gilbert Stuart Museum. I know she has a lot of information to share.
I'd like to reiterate everybody's welcome. We're going to be covering approximately 279 years of history in this lecture. So some of the things will be cursory, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions at the end. So the history of this site, iconic birthplace, stretches back as far as the Petticombscot land purchase of 1656. But the story that we're telling today is of the birthplace building itself, which was constructed in 1751. In that year, Edward Cole of Newport, Dr. Thomas Moffat, also of Newport, and Gilbert Stuart of North Kingstown entered into articles of co-ownership of an enterprise to manufacture snuff and erect a mill at Petticombscot. Edward Cole was, at the time, the owner of over 290 acres of farmland, mills, and attendant water rights, including the half-acre lot where the birthplace now sits. Thomas Moffat, a doctor by training, who was recently settled in Newport, was to provide the financial backing for the endeavor, and the newly married Gilbert Stuart was to provide the operational expertise, building, maintaining, and operating the mill itself. And for each man's contribution, they were to receive a 1/3 share of the profits. From its earliest days, the birthplace building was unique in that it was both a place of business and a mill and a residency within the same structure. In many ways, it's this peculiarity that has allowed the building to survive for as long as it has, particularly after the birth on the upper portion of Gilbert Stuart on December 7th, 1755. The mill was in more or less constant operation for 10 years, running from 1751 to 1761. 2 years into the mill's operation, in 1753, Edward Cole sold his third of the enterprise to Thomas Moffat, including the mill and the surrounding farmland, for £12,000 old tenor. The birthplace and mill remained occupied with the Stuart family until 1761, when Gilbert Stuart Sr. sold his third of the enterprise to Dr. Moffat and moved the young family to Newport. You'll get this on the tour if you ever come by for a normal day. From this point on, the snuff milling enterprise was more or less over, as Dr. Moffat was now the sole proprietor of both the land and the enterprise. He, however, would soon have his own problems. Moffat was an ardent and outspoken royalist, and in 1765, only 4 years later, he would be hung and burnt in effigy outside the Colony House, and later have his home ransacked because of his writings in support of the Stamp Act. He pretty soon escaped back to Britain and functionally abandoned the birthplace. He abandoned a lot of other things, but that's what's relevant to our story. In all likelihood, the building didn't sit empty. But since no occupants or operator of the mill would have been legal, it's quite difficult to say. We do know that there was at least one occupant during the period because in 1780, the land was confiscated by the state. And to quote the Rhode Island Colonial Record, whereas are now on the farm in possession of Benwin Albro, the likely current tenant, lately belonging to Thomas Moffat in North Kingstown, one water wheel, cogwheel, and other parts of a wheat mill, which are not of any use to the state and are daily decaying. In 1783, 3 years later, the general treasurer sold the property to Colonel Archibald Crary of East Greenwich, who sold it to Peter Burlingame the same day, and from this point on, the Birthplace has legal owners and legal residents. Whether under the auspices of the Burlingame family or earlier, the snuff mill was removed at this period from the lower level of the house, and so the structure, for the most part, from now on, is a two-story residence. The Burlingame's family holdings included 50 acres of land, a grist mill, and a sawmill, which the family would occupy for 2 generations over the course of 30 years. In December of 1813, Peter Burlingame's children sold 10 acres, the house and the grist mill, to Benjamin Hammond of North Kingstown. You'll all recognize his name from a variety of sources, but if nothing else here, we name the grist mill still bears his name. One of the reasons it bears his name, we have named it officially after him, but colloquially for the next 100 years easily, colloquially, that's how that building is referred to. In fact, frequently the buildings are confused and the grist mill is referred to as the snuff mill, and even the birthplace of Gilbert Stuart, even though it only holds machinery. So, the Hammond family set up residence in the Birthplace building, and Benjamin Hammond operated the grist mill across the dam. Under the Hammonds' operation, the grist mill gained a reputation for the fineness of the cornmeal it produces. We have pages here from the Johnny Cake papers, which not only are illustrated with a picture of the birthplace, but contain the anecdote that my grandfather used to have in his kitchen an old cook by the name of Phyllis, originally from Senegambia or Guinea, who probably made as good a Johnny Cake in her day as any other artist known. I could gather from observation as follows: premising she always insisted on having white Narragansett corn ground at what is now called Hammond's Mill, which is situated just on the other side of the elder Gilbert Stuart snuff mill, just above the head of the Pettisquamcut Pond or lake. Nor could Phyllis be induced by any persuasion to touch meal ground at any other mill. At this point, the house has been the birthplace of Gilbert Stuart for decades now. But since the artist left at the age of 6, this is not a fact many people know, outside of Stuart himself. In 1826, Gilbert Stuart, who is now 72 years old and at the height of his fame, made inquiries to Benjamin Hammond, asking if he could come by and visit his childhood home. This is something that Hammond recorded assiduously, and it's by virtue of this visit that we know that everyone, essentially at this point, knows that this is the building in which Gilbert Stuart was born. Moreover, since during his visit, Benjamin Hammond recorded Stuart as saying that this room to the left of the entrance is the room I've always been told I was born in. So we now know both of those facts. This late life visit happened only 2 years before the artist's death, and both Stuart's fame and the birthplace's fame would only continue to grow. Take it back a bit. It is during this period, after Benjamin Hammond's passing, but while the mill was in operation by his son, it would be in operation by both his son and his grandson. But it's during this period of occupancy by the Hammond family that we see one of the earliest published accounts of, hold on one second, of an attempted pilgrimage to the Gilbert Stuart birthplace. There we go. In an 1855 issue of the Manufacturer and Farmers Journal, there is an extensive description of the birthplace building that concludes with the observation, "We endeavored to make an entrance into the venerable house, thinking possibly we might also gain a sight of the room in which Stuart was born. But there was no one home but a young girl, who, with the dog, barred the entrance." I just love the image of a very random adult man trying to get past a small child into a house that he doesn't live in and does not know anyone who lives there, and then, in his deep offense, wrote about it in the newspaper. The third generation of Hammond Millers, Mr. William Sherman, passed away in 1875. So the mill has been in constant operation since its purchase in 1813 to the end of Mr. Sherman's life in 1875. There we go. There was a little out of order there. The family's long occupancy and focus on the grist mill structure led to extensive changes in the appearance of the birthplace. A turbine had been added to the mill, and extensive additions to the component structures had been made, including a covered shed over top of the dam that appears in many of the early photographs of the building, but as you'll see is no longer present. Mr. Sherman's widow sold the property 3 years after her husband's death in 1878 to John W. Cady. The Cady family were only resident in the house for 7 years until 1885. Doubtless, the intrusion of visitors continued as the Narragansett Herald described the site as a destination for many tourists yearly. May go some way to explain the short time of their stay. Pardon me. Oops. In 1885, the property was purchased by a larger-than-life figure in North Kingstown history and easily the second biggest name after Stuart himself. And that is Captain George N. Kenyon. Captain Kenyon had made his fortune at sea and then had already purchased and operated the Ocean House Hotel. And in the same year that he purchased the Birthplace, he also finished construction on the Petasquamscott House Hotel. Pardon me. Despite owning the hotel, Captain Kenyon purchased the Birthplace with the express purpose of taking up milling, something that there is no indication he had any idea how to do or any experience of doing. Nonetheless, we see this is a transcript of the newspaper clipping that appeared very soon after his purchase. Love to find the original. But in it, as you can see, he says, "Stuffed mill and birthplace of Gilbert Stuart, now prepared to reduce Rhode Island corn to flour of any fineness desired. A bell will be erected at the mill, and if the miller is not in, ring the bell. Corn and meal on hand for sale for cash, as no books will be kept. 3 quarts toll for all grain ground." Now, there's a lot of red flags in that ad, and they would not have been missed by the average citizen in North Kingston, because he had developed a pretty thoroughgoing reputation by this point as a, not to put too fine a point on it, a crazy person. He was good at his business, but was well known to engage volubly in local politics and to have erratic and occasionally violent mood swings, and also periods of erratic decision-making, erratic and difficult to justify decision-making. So if this sounds like an odd decision for him to make, it doesn't even scratch the surface. Things had gotten so bad for him and his wife that his wife attempted to have him institutionalized 2 years later in 1887. His wife, with the assistance of many of his business partners. He unsurprisingly objected to this attempt to have him institutionalized. The case went to court, and there were extensive trials on his comparative sanity. And to give you an idea, while he was eventually found to be of sufficiently sound mind to be left on his own recognizance, this purchase was counted as one of his sane moves and a example of his financial probity. So while he ultimately won, by one account, he concluded the trial by swearing vengeance on everyone who testified against him. So you're getting an idea of the man. One of the main differences between George Kenyon and any of the other millers who operated in there, aside from experience and knowledge, is that he was very enthusiastic about the house's identity as the Stuart birthplace and its ability to draw tourists. Unlike the account of the gentleman being barred at the door by a small child, there is in this period, in the 1880s, there are accounts of various pilgrimages to the birthplace, where upon knocking at the door, they are greeted warmly and invited to dinner. So he's very enthusiastic about this element of life here on this spot. And in fact, by 1891, Kenyon had decided to lean fully into the birthplace's identity as a destination, as a tourist destination, and hired a workman by the name of Jack McGinnis to help him convert the birthplace from a residence into a demi-hotel and restaurant. So I think some of you know where this story's going. McGinnis had been hired on in April at a wage of $80 a month. By August, he had received in wages only $2. On August 12th, he was sufficiently angry at having not been paid that he approached Kenyon for his wages. Kenyon continually rebuffed him and continually tried to get away from him. Unsurprisingly, McGinnis didn't take that lightly. And I'm trying to stick to the confirmed facts that everyone agrees upon. There's a lot of differing accounts of this entire incident, but it comes to a head when McGinnis tries to follow Kenyon into the birthhouse, and Kenyon shoots him in the chest. Shoots him a second time as well. Kenyon would later claim that McGinnis tried to attack him and that McGinnis tried to push him into the river and drown him. Kenyon would also argue that McGinnis was a known drunk. He was, but not known to be particularly violent. Kenyon would also insist that he was not only acting in self-defense, but that he was perfectly sober throughout all of this. Unfortunately, this doesn't persuade a lot of people, given the other things Kenyon got up to while he was completely sober. So when Kenyon realizes that he's hurt McGinnis much more than he meant to, he does contact the authorities, and the police and press and doctors all arrive late that night. Early the next morning, he is still alive, but not for much longer. His last words were, "So this is what I get for my wages." This news is greeted by a number of by the press in an exciting variety of ways, including one North Kingstown newspaper which said, "Finally, he's actually killed a man." And whereas press from slightly further away, indicating the renown of the house that's spreading nearly as fast, press from Providence laments that the birthplace of Gilbert Stuart has been besmirched by a horrible murder. Kenyon is arrested, and most accounts say he was not given bail, but there are a number of newspaper accounts that reference his doings in and around the birthplace between 1891 and his eventual sentencing in 1893. So I strongly suspect that if he didn't get bail right away, it did happen pretty soon after. But Stuart, he had, as I said before, he really leaned into the birthplace identity as a tourist destination. Well, we see these segments right here are the extra sheds that we saw earlier that had been built up during the Hammond's ownership. We see other things like this terrace out on the lawn side of the birthplace, which we see small children playing around. You can also see the edge of a fountain right here. Is that not showing up? Yep, there we go. A fountain here that was installed for visitors at under Kenyon's ownership. You see another view of the fountain here and the terrace. This is when we start to see tourist photographs. So, and it's not entirely clear, obviously, whether this is because of the dawn of and popularization of like box brownie photographs, or just because Kenyon provided something that was really worth photographing. So these tourist photos are actually dated around 1885 and labeled as evidence of improvements that Kenyon had made. However, in this picture right here, you see that arch that shows up in a lot of the old photos of the house. This further evidence that he hadn't really gone anywhere yet. We see a press report that Captain Kenyon is having painted for display at his place near here, variously known as Hammond's Mill and the Snuff Mill and Stuart Dale, a large sign bearing the following inscription: "The birthplace of Gilbert Stuart, now a lunatic's retreat." It is supposed that the captain intends to make use of the sign in conjunction with his scheme of opening a boarding house at his place. He is cited as, there's a number of businesses that are cited as being part of Kenyon's plan. But being as the only one he'd made moves on was the Demi Hotel and Restaurant, things like the boarding house and lunatic's retreat were unlikely that he was planning on following up on any of those, and people were very, very eager to copy anything that he said, particularly if it was obviously insane. So, Kenyon would be tried and convicted of murder, exhausting his appeals process in 1893. Nonetheless, he continued to greet visitors until the last. There are newspaper accounts for every single year after the murder, but before his conviction, commenting on how many groups of tourists came to visit his place. Presumably as a marketing ploy, Kenyon even attempted to rename the pond Lake Tangernisia. He insisted on calling the area now called Saunderstown Stuarttown or Stuartdale or Stuartville. And yes, we have the famous sign which dates pictures of the house very nicely. It does appear that he only got the birthplace of Gilbert Stuart. He may have printed the lunatic's retreat, but also might not have. That one stays for a while. Since visits to the building were not put off by the murder conviction, they also didn't cease when Kenyon was incarcerated. The birthplace got put up for sale in 1895, and this is the sketchiest transition that there is. There's not a lot of good documentation. It does appear to have been in the hands of the Kenyon, if not Kenyon, then his descendants until the turn of the century. At some point between 1900 and 1915, it is purchased by Walter Green. Under Green's ownership, the birthplace's fame continued to grow, with the state of Rhode Island commissioning a plaque in 1906 to commemorate the site of Stuart's birth. Nonetheless, Green does not appear to have been overly concerned with preserving or maintaining the site. He doesn't appear averse to the tourists, but at the same time, he doesn't have any interest in humoring them either. He actually, in fact, more than anything else, appears to be more of an absentee landlord who really likes fishing. That is the vast majority of the information we get from him. In fact, one tenant that gets a lot of mention is an artist that he rented the place out to, who proceeded to paint murals all over the walls. Much to the distress of the building's eventual next owners, who would be us, the Gilbert Stuart Memorial. This is where we see the, this is a nice little post photo. Nathaniel Vose, a prominent Providence art dealer, was one of the many individuals who would regularly pilgrimage to the birthplace. He had a summer home in the area and a great interest in both Stuart and local history. Many people, even us, frequently refer to the beginning of his attempts to purchase the site as being in the 20s. We actually have a letter where he wrote, a letter his lawyer wrote to Walter Green attempting to purchase it as early as 1915. At which point, he reached out to Mr. Green's legal representative, and Green was not willing to sell all of the property that Vose had in mind, and he wanted $6,000 for the property that he was willing to sell. So the negotiations stalled out. Vose, as the 1920s is generally referred to his big push, did not lose interest. And Vose's efforts to purchase the birthplace continued throughout the 1920s, and he began to see success really only after the founding of the South County Art Association, which happened in 1929. With the assistance of this like-minded group of art enthusiasts, Vose was able to generate the necessary interest and funds to make progress on the birthplace purchase. Professor Herbert Cross, who was then the president of the South County Art Association, established the Gilbert Stuart Memorial Committee in 1930 to establish the project as a distinct legal entity from the South County Art Association. The Gilbert Stuart Memorial Committee would eventually become, in about a year's time after the success of the purchase, the Gilbert Stuart Memorial Incorporated, which currently does business under the name Gilbert Stuart Birthplace and Museum. Negotiations at this time were progressing very swiftly between Vose and Green for the purchase of the property. By August of 1930, the Memorial Committee had secured the right of refusal, and the price for the property had been stabilized at around $11,000. It had gone as high as $50,000 at one point, but Vose was fairly confident that the $11,000, twice what he was offered last time, was about the best they were going to get now. The group was able to complete the payments and purchase the property outright by the end of that month, the last payment being made on the 1st of September. So this is a list of the original donors. You can see the donations range from $10 to $2,000. And that was what made the initial very isolated property purchase possible. Even though the house was secured legally, the fight to preserve the structure was far from over. While the committee were successful in raising the initial $11,000 in funding, many questioned the wisdom of a fundraising campaign of this magnitude happening at the height of the Great Depression. Because remember, this is 1930 to 31. Unfortunately, Norman Isham would point out that by the time the purchase was achieved, the house had fallen into such excessive disrepair that had they waited any longer, there was a very real possibility that the structure wouldn't survive. Unsurprisingly, as soon as the property was secured, the committee, now incorporated as the Gilbert Stuart Memorial, had to immediately begin fundraising to cover the extensive and necessary repairs. The board members immediately began a nationwide fundraising effort, contacting individuals, newspapers, academics, artists, art dealers, art collectors. They sent fundraising letters to members of the DAR and a multitude of other colonial-era fraternal organizations and groups. And this was the height of, or the growth, so the early stages of the neo-colonial movement. So as colonial movements were proliferating across the United States, they were all getting letters begging for money from us. So that nationwide fundraising effort did keep the property on, keep the property and the restoration effects going. So in August 29th of 1931, the Gilbert Stuart Memorial held an opening ceremony. So there we go. That was supposed to load on its own. All right. I don't know how to do this. Pardon me. There we go. On August 29th, 1931, the memorial held an opening ceremony in which the public were invited to come to the birthplace to enjoy the progress that had so far been made. An admission charge of 25 cents was asked for to enter the birthplace and look around, and an additional charge of 10 cents was asked to view the snuff mill. More than 390 people would attend this event, and now that they were accepting visitors, over 1,000 people would come for this opening year of 1931. In an 18th century snuff mill, obviously renovations needed to continue. The snuff mill had been removed from the Birthplace building, quite famously, and had the wheel, which provided it power. So that was one of the first challenges for the restoration. The museum was the Memorial Fund was extremely fortunate to have not only Norman Isham on our founding board, but through his connections, he had been researching snuff mills and their history and maintenance with an expert in England by the name of H.W. Dickinson. In the winter of 1831, Dickinson made available through a series of letters between Vose, Isham, and H.W. Dickinson, he was willing to donate a mill from the same age as the one that was missing, with the only cost to the museum being the cost of transportation. And not only did he provide that, but with pictures, diagrams, and all of the instructions required for the mill to be reconstructed at the end. So that's the wheel having arrived with Caroline Hazard posing on it. And as you can see, the wheel behind, the direct drive wheel, has been installed. Over that winter, or spring really, a new snuff mill wheel would be built. Fresh undershot wheel, and so the committee held yet another celebration in August of 1932. This celebration would be to acknowledge the completion of the sale and the transfer of deed of the final 16 acres of land to the property, which makes up our current 23, and to celebrate the initial operation of the snuff mill. These are all labeled, so you can see the original committee members, Norman Isham, Caroline Hazard, Nathaniel Vose, and Mrs. Green. And then they're all up in the corner, all looking very eagerly down to watch the mill operate for the first time in over 100 years. Work would continue on the birthplace and mill more or less forever, as would the fundraising necessary to cover those costs. But by the end of the 1930s, the primary goals of the Gilbert Stuart Memorial Incorporated were achieved. The preservation of the birthplace had begun, and the buildings and site were now open to the public. In order to maintain access to the public, as well as security for the building, the land, and the structures, it was decided that a caretaker should live on the grounds of the birthplace. Initially, there were a lot of discussions about how that would work out. There was discussion of having them live in a screened-off space. Eventually, the decision was made to create a room for the caretaker in the birthplace. In fact, there's notes about buying him a screen door at one point. But a lot of ideas were thrown around, including following an idea that had been proposed in the interim between Kenyon's ownership and the memorial's ownership of turning it into a tea house and allowing residence for the hostess as a way to fund the repairs. And as an aside, I'm going to take this opportunity to say that that was an awesome idea. We hold 2 of them a year, and it's a fabulous site for the event. Ultimately, the caretaker was to live, as I said, in a small room which was part of the birthplace itself until a separate dwelling could be constructed in 1936. I'm sure you've all seen it. It's right next door to here. The caretakers would, from then on, for the next several decades, be the primary operators of the birthplace, as well as its public face from 1933 to 2005. They would greet visitors, provide tours of the house and grounds, as well as manage the maintenance and day-to-day operation of the site, and are still fondly remembered by many visitors to the birthplace. One particular contribution made by the caretakers was the extremely novel junior docent program, and we are regularly visited by graduates of the program who have very fond memories of the site. While repairs are perpetually ongoing and will be ongoing into the future, the last of the site's major restoration projects actually occurred as recently as 2007, when the Hammond grist mill was finally restored to full operation. When that wheel, photos of it being restored, so all the parts were there, they needed to be assembled correctly, and milling is a extremely precise profession, and all of the parts needed to be put together in exactly the right way so that it didn't destroy everything. So we had this lovely team led by Andy Shrake here, who is still, if you see major work going on, he was in charge of the restoration of the dam only 2 years ago. If you see major work going on, it's probably being led by him. So when that wheel ran, at the end of this project, grinding corn as part of our 2007 spring fair, it was the first time that the mill had been in operation for over a century. This final restoration was done under the auspices of the most recent executive director, my predecessor, Margaret O'Connor. In addition to completing the restoration of the Hammond grist mill, she was also responsible for the fundraising drives that led to the initial construction of a welcome center in 2009 and its expansion to include this beautiful gallery. Her work led to the professionalization of the museum, as well as to the start of our own collection of Gilbert Stuart paintings. With how far we've come in the last 273 years, I know I speak for everyone at the museum when I say that we are all excited about the future and our growing role within the North Kingstown community. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions? I realize I gave a very flying view of all of that. Yes?
So I noticed in the architecture drawing that you had of the building that it was works progress administration.
Yes.
Is the birthplace in the National Historic Register?
It is. Both of the buildings were, a lot of that was aided by Isham's role as as a founding member of our board and the lead of the restoration project. He worked closely with the Works Progress Administration. Not that the building wouldn't have been included before, it does show up in the history of Washington and Kent counties, as well as several books on historic American buildings from really just the 1880s onward. But Isham participated with them, and I believe, although I am not 100% confident that he is responsible for the architectural drawings, I know he is responsible for, for the assessment. For the narrative assessment that goes on here. I'm not sure you can see all of this, but this is marked original building, later addition, wooden shed, wooden sluice gates, front of this location, so probable location of original chimney. So these Works Progress Administration drawings were not only served as a record of the structure, but as the guide by which the museum would continue to be renovated.
Yes.
Yes.
So the mill is, the mills are birthplace, is snuff mill. So where was the tobacco grown for this snuff?
All over the place in Rhode Island. Most of it was coming from Rhode Island. There is, obviously we don't think of Rhode Island as being a tobacco producer nowadays. One of the things I like to point out in tours, we survived to process corn and tobacco, and neither of those are what you're thinking of when you think of the words corn or tobacco. The corn you're thinking of, in fact, both of the products had been cultivated by the indigenous people for generations, both to survive in this climate and to function in different ways than we really think of them nowadays. The tobacco had largely been cultivated for ceremonial use. Its high tobacco content is innate of that. Is innate of the spiritual component rather than which is also one of the reasons why it's a much more difficult smoke from what I've heard. I haven't tried it myself. Whereas it's been culturally supplanted by the type of tobacco that originated in Jamaica and came up through the American South. That tobacco has a lower nicotine content, but is smokable. Not that the old tobacco wasn't smoked, but apparently it was a much more painful experience to adjust yourself to that. Likewise, the corn that we're thinking of was grown here. It is Rhode Island is still very proud of its white-cap flint corn, even though it's less proud of its tobacco rustica cultivation. But that had been cultivated to not only to grow in this soil and this climate, but also to function as a grain rather than as a vegetable in its own right. So it had an amazingly low water content and only needed to be dried for about 6 months before it was suitable to grind, which is not the case with your summer corn on the cob. If you tried to grind that after even 6 months, that's going to be a mess. But of course, since tobacco is a New World product, it was grown pretty widely. It had a sufficiently ready market and was grown here that if you could get hold of it, you could grow it and make a profit.
They didn't grow it on this property, did they?
No, and that's it probably was grown very close to here, and in all likelihood, that farm was owned by the same person who owned the mill, because remember Coles, when the snuff mill was in place, Coles land ownership extended to 290 acres. And farms, I don't know how many, but there's definitely an S at the end of that word. As well as several other mills. There's a whole sawmill and a fulling mill in this story that have nothing to do with Gilbert Stuart. We only know they exist because they are recorded. They are part of someone else's story, but they're definitely here and part of the land ownership issue that comes, or the land ownership history. Did I answer your question? I can't remember anymore, sorry. Anyone else? Yes?
How old is this building?
This building right here was built in 2014. Yes, it is 10 years old. It was completed in 2014. The first exhibition was held in 2015, so that'll be next year.
You said that Gilbert Stuart came back to see his birthplace. Did he make any kind of contributions to its restoration, or are there living family members who have come back to?
I don't think it was a relevant consideration when he came by, because it was the Hammonds were operating the mill and had already begun to receive renown for their operation of the mill. It was a perfectly serviceable house, fairly new at the time, but so it wouldn't have made sense for them to offer for him to contribute at that point. And then while Stuart had 12 children, he had no grandchildren, and there are no descendants to contribute to the restoration or maintenance of the building.
What is like your dam maintenance like?
The dam maintenance is very exciting history. It needs to be repaired and replaced a surprisingly large number of times. One of the things that surprised me in the museum's records, the place floods like every 40 years. So, in all honesty, I'm slightly glad that our most recent flood's not that far in the past. Hopefully they don't start happening more often. But several of those accounts mention damage to the dam. I know they were all being rebuilt in the at the time of the construction. Some of the early photographs show the dam in the 1930s, show the dam being rebuilt, show the secondary dam between the Stuart House and the now empty lot being reconstructed as well. There's a lot of talk. As soon as the museum, I don't know if this goes back further than the museum, but as soon as it was owned by the museum, we were very concerned with maintaining a fish ladder and keeping the fish run active. But I don't know how far back that particular history goes.
How tall is the dam?
That is a big. If you're very interested, I can actually pull up the engineering diagrams of the dam, since the last time it was replaced was only 2 years ago.
Oh, wow. And it already needs to be replaced.
No, it doesn't need to be replaced. That one, I have been promised that one will last for generations. It is, so, knock on wood, cross your fingers. So, yes, barring any catastrophic event, we should be, that dam should see us all out.
So when was the original dam put in?
That is a very good question, in part because the dam keeps changing. As early as, it doesn't appear to have changed much since the start of this story in 1751. However, immediately prior to coming into Edward Cole's possession, there's a lot of discussion about how much land is owned because it is on the edge of the lot, and half an acre to an acre keeps getting bounced in ownership based on the flow of the river. So they keep putting dams up in other places in order to get more land for themselves. And apparently it is very much the site where the Stuart House is now that was part of that tug of war. Since the Stuart House was constructed, nobody's moved the water again. So although again, if the records are to be believed, and there would have not been any need for an additional dam for a fulling mill, which is included in the records, but a sawmill would have required a completely different structure, a much higher watermark, or a much longer fall for the water to be operational. So it is likely that there was probably, just only relying on that information, there was probably another dam further up the stream. Beyond that, there's no other record of how the sawmill operated, only that it did. And it shows up in records that are like decades apart, so it did operate. Anyone else?
Would that creek be tidal if the dam wasn't there?
One more time, sorry.
Would the creek be tidally influenced?
That I don't know. Probably the portion of the water downstream from the dam does have some measure of tidal influence, whereas the portion upstream of the dam is fed through, there's about 3 freshwater sources that, freshwater streams that feed it. It may or may not have a stream, I have a spring. Yeah, but it also sits in a valley, which is, so I do know from rough personal experience that if I don't pay enough attention to the runoff of a rainfall, that water's gonna rise real fast. Yeah, it was about a month ago. That was the one factor that I didn't account for, and then we got to reenact the flooding from 2009. So that was fun. Not fully reenacted, but in that like safe way where you use blanks. Anyone else? Yes.
Tim Preston told us there were only 2 natural ponds in North Kingstown. This was one of them. They made a dam and made it bigger.
Yeah.
The other was the Kettle Hole Pond.
That makes a lot of sense. That's what I said. I don't know if it's spring-fed, which the Cranston I would trust Tim, and that would make that seem all the more likely. And then yeah, the dam, like I said, the dam's been.
All the other ponds in town were created by damming trees.
Yeah, and this one gets messed with dams. And as I said, the missing records of the Sawmill Dam indicate that it may actually have been even bigger at one point. Is anybody else? Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming out on such a exciting day weather-wise.